It's my pleasure now to really introduce a remarkable scholar, chair of our planning committee, whose grandfather was interned at the Santa Fe Internment Camp. Her name is Dr. Gail Okawa. She's Professor Emeritus of English, Youngstown State University, Ohio, author of Remembering Our Grandfather's Exile, U.S. Imprisonment of Hawaii's Japanese in World War II. Embarking on internment research in 2002, when she was a scholar in residence at the Smithsonian. She attended the dedication of the Santa Fe Internment Camp historical marker and found it life-changing. She was then inspired to propose and co-organize the 10th anniversary commemoration of the marker dedication in 2012, as well as this 20th anniversary event in 2022. Domo arigatou gozaimasu, Gail. So please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. We're very grateful for your attendance and your attention, and we hope to learn with you. This is one Issei story and many Issei stories, the journey of immigrants. My grandfather, Tamasaku Watanabe, made some choices as a young man. Like so many immigrants, he had chosen to leave his village in Hiroshima, Japan, for San Francisco via Seattle in 1905 at age 22. He was baptized as a Christian there and served as the secretary of the Japanese YMCA, precursor to the Japanese Presbyterian Church. Witnessing the devastation of the Great San Francisco earthquake, which some of you may remember, not personally, of course, he had been inspired to enter the San Francisco Theological Seminary to formally join the Christian ministry. He married and started a family in California. First served at the Japanese Presbyterian Church in Stockton, then at the Japanese Christian Church, the Japanese Church of Christ in Sacramento. But in the early 1920s, he decided to answer the call to serve as an evangelist in the Hawaiian Islands, which of course at that time were pretty undeveloped. In October 1922, when the family was preparing to leave for Hawaii, their youngest child was killed in an accident with an oil truck. Although grieving for this loss, Reverend Watanabe packed up his family, grandma, and 3 children, and they made the difficult trip across the ocean a few weeks later. He was first assigned to the island of Maui, where he served Wailuku Japanese Christian Church members for 12 years. And there he is smiling in the back row. Then transferred to the island of Hawai'i, the Big Island, to serve plantation workers in Ola'a. This was on the east side, or the Hilo side of the island. As an ordained minister, he attended professional meetings. What I didn't know is that he was arrested on December 7th, 1941, at his parsonage on that Sunday morning and imprisoned until November 1945, months after the war ended. Like hundreds of others in Hawaii, nearly 700 sent to the mainland, and among 4,500 in Santa Fe. My research journey spanned 20 years and is ongoing. It started with two kinds of triggers, what I call triggers. Some were personal. It wasn't until 50 years after the war in the 1990s and years after my grandfather's death that my mother shared some letters from New Mexico, and I found this lone photo among the internment papers carefully stored in an old trunk. My mother recognized her father in the third row, but the location was quite a mystery. I had some suspicions due to the vigas that I'd seen in New Mexico previously. In the early 2000s, I finally had a chance to research what happened to him. The second set of triggers I consider public events. In 2001, I began developing a research project on my grandfather when 9/11 happened. Another external attack on the US with racial profiling and hysteria against many innocents. Parallels to December 7th brought home the immediate significance of this project. In 2002, I came to Santa Fe to see what I could find in the State Library and Archives, and met Colonel Joe Ando and Dr. Thomas Chavez, both co-chairs of the Marker Committee, who invited me to the dedication of the Santa Fe Historical Marker on April 20th. What I learned had been a very controversial community issue, so this would be highly significant in terms of community healing. Several hundred people from Alaska, Hawaii, and the mainland attended the event, and this had a profound effect on me. I describe this in some detail in my book, and I hope you'll indulge my reading a short passage. I was moved by the attendance of internee families from all over the country and the social, political, and spiritual significance of the event. At the luncheon reception following the dedication, Colonel Ando asked me to speak to the crowd, and I surprised myself by overcoming my shyness and addressing the large audience as an intimate one, bound by the common inheritance of internment and among non-Japanese Americans, the desire not to forget. The attentiveness of the audience brought the gravity of my project home to me. I began to realize my place and the place of my research in relation to the Japanese American community and the American public at large. This was a responsibility, not just an academic exercise. What I've learned on this journey was that my grandfather's arrest and internment was a part of an agreement by the Department of Justice and the War Department in July 1941, distinct from the WRA forced evacuation from the West Coast 2 months later via Executive Order 9066. In the National Archives, I also found the files of hundreds of other Issei men from Hawaii. For example, this photo from the Santa Fe Internment Camp pictures a group of Hawaii Issei internees, and I discovered that these were all on the same transfer boat as my grandfather leaving Hawaii. From various parts of Japan, they also had chosen to make the trip across the ocean. They had lives, families, and occupations. And I'll just introduce a few of them to you. Reverend Fujitani was a Buddhist priest. Reverend Ikuma was a Shinto priest. Mr. Kinoshita was a plantation worker. Mr. Kato was a coffee farmer. Mr. Kawasaki was an attorney. Mr. Shigenaga was a businessman. Mr. Ohama and Mr. Mizutani were both Japanese school principals. there was my grandfather, a Christian minister, congregational minister. So they all had lives, they all had families. But due to anti-Japanese immigration laws and attitudes, Japanese immigrants were outlawed from US citizenship and remained aliens. On December 7th, that day of many infamies, many Japanese men in Hawaii, like my grandfather, were suddenly arrested and taken from their families. The Department of Justice, especially through the FBI, in collaboration with the US Army, targeted mainly community leaders in Hawaii, then imprisoned and exiled nearly 700 of them to the mainland, which is a long story in my book. Fathers and grandfathers, some of whom I've written about. How did this happen? When war was declared with Japan after the attack on Pearl Harbor, their immigration status changed instantly to alien enemy. This was an immigration status. Some of you undoubtedly know that this happened with Issei men from the mainland. Fathers and grandfathers disappeared, beginning on December 7th, 1941, over 2 months before Executive Order 9066. The FBI had lists and files. This is just an example of what was called the ABC list. This is the A part of the ABC list. My grandfather was arrested in his parsonage on that Sunday morning. We have no other details. We can only imagine how shocking and humiliating it was for him. This is the warrant for his arrest. Rather than for a crime, he was arrested on suspicion of being an alien enemy, which, as I mentioned, was an immigration status. Mr. Otani, who was a businessman, was arrested in his yukata, which was a bathrobe. He had immigrated from a fishing village in Japan when he was 18 and had developed a good business in Honolulu. He had also developed a heart condition and wasn't well in midlife. But on December 7th, the FBI and military came to his home, his son Akira told me. The agent pointed a gun at him, pulled him roughly to his feet, and began to shove him into the car without allowing him to change his clothes. Fortunately, his wife threw his coat and shoes into the car before they drove off. Issei Kato, the coffee farmer I introduced you to earlier on Hawaii Island, describes his later arrest on February 22nd, 1942, when he was informed by his 16-year-old son that the police had come for him and he had to say goodbye to his young children. At 8 a.m., I was tending the garden when Chiaki came running. He seemed worried that I might be arrested. I told him not to worry, as I'd done nothing wrong. I asked him to help, thank you. I asked him to help mother stay strong. I encouraged him to keep up the coffee farm, the work on the coffee farm. Chiaki looked helpless, but agreed. The officer formally asked for my name, searched me for unlawful possessions, and ordered me to get ready as he was taking me to the marshal, and that I was not to take anything with me. I was ordered to speak only in English. Haruko, this was his young daughter, carried Nobuko, and Toshiko was in Chiaki's arms. These were twin babies. Shigeo was half crying. I reached out and clasped each child's hand in silent farewell. Kato, like my grandfather, was detained at the Kilauea military camp so this is a page of the transcript, the hearing transcript. I won't be able to read this due to time constraints, but suffice it to say, the interrogator repeatedly insisted that Reverend Watanabe choose countries. Which country do you want to win? Japan, your country, or our country? That's the question he kept asking. And then he later admitted, well, maybe it's not a fair question. The hearing board, or interrogators, concluded first that the internee is a subject of Japan, that the internee owes allegiance to Japan, and that the internee's activities have been pro-Japanese, though not necessarily anti-American. They voted 3-1 for his release, but he was sent to the Honolulu immigration station, where they took his mugshot. He was age 59, then sent him to Sand Island Internment Camp, where the order for release was reversed by the Intelligence Board, consisting of the Army, Navy, and FBI. And you can see at the very bottom, I don't know if I guess it's kind of difficult to see it on the slide, but at the very bottom of the screen, it actually says, it appearing necessary, it is ordered that Tomosaku Watanabe be interned. As an English teacher, the use of the passive voice was very interesting to me. So he and hundreds of other Hawai'i Issei were interned, not for specific wrongdoing, but it appearing necessary. Then they were exiled due to convoluted political reasons, which I describe in my book. Nearly 700 prisoners were shipped to the mainland, sent on 10 transfer boats at different times from the islands, beginning on February 20th, 1942. And these maps help you to see a little bit of the government resources that were expended to transport these men all over the country. They document their exile from their families and their homes, and you can see that there were 4 main routes, starting from Hawaii, of course, to Angel Island, which you saw in the slides for the players. The first transfer boat went from Angel Island to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, then to Camp Forest, Tennessee, to Camp Livingston, Louisiana, which is where they ended up, before they were sent to Fort Missoula, Montana, and eventually some sent to Santa Fe. Some of them were sent from Camp Livingston directly to Santa Fe. Others were sent to Fort Missoula first. Second transfer boat went from Angel Island to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, then to Camp Livingston, and then again, some were sent to Fort Missoula and others were sent directly to Santa Fe. The third transfer boat, which is on this top map, was the boat that my grandfather and these other men on the transfer boat 3 were sent from Angel Island to Fort Sam Houston in Texas, and then to Camp Lordsburg and to Santa Fe. But one of the things that I'm learning, I've been learning this every time I talk to someone, it seems I learn new things, and recently learned from a family member and from Dr. Duncan Williams that some Santa Fe internees from Hawaii actually came through Sharp Park, California. So the third transfer boat then, with these men, and this was my grandfather again. This was the itinerary that I found in his papers, which verifies that routing that I just showed you, that they went from the Kilauea military camp on the Big Island to the immigration station to Sand Island to Angel Island, and then across the ocean, across the country to Fort Sam Houston in Texas, Lordsburg, and Santa Fe. I wondered how my grandfather in his 59th year felt returning to San Francisco as a prisoner at Angel Island when he had left California for Hawaii with his young family in 1922, a free man, looking forward to his third ministry in the islands. They were sent by train on June 4th to Fort Sam Houston. This was an army camp. And they were in the, let's see if I can do this. They were in the, basically in the top three lines of tents, rows of tents. So they were in over 100-degree heat for 10 days. Then they were transferred to Lordsburg. We don't have photos of Lordsburg, but we do have sketches from George Hoshida. These are in the Japanese American National Museum. This was another army camp where they were for about a year, first under the harsh treatment of a lieutenant colonel named Lundy, who ignored many internee rights dictated by the Geneva Convention, as I discuss at some length in my book. Due to the internees assertively advocating for their rights, however, stories involving Genji Mihara of Seattle, Reverend Yoshiaki Fukuda of San Francisco, and Kango Kawasaki here, whom I introduced you to earlier, the attorney from Hilo. Lundy was replaced by a more reasonable camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ledbetter. It was here that Reverend Fukuda, a Konkokyo minister, my grandfather, a Christian minister, and Reverend Hosho Kurohira, a Buddhist priest, submitted a multi-faith petition that redefined the concept of family to be culturally sensitive in Japanese terms. The government wanted to intern in this family camp only the immediate members of the family, whereas the petition asked that older family members, older children, be included as well. And so they made a case for that definition of family, which apparently was respected by the government, and that was the way it was handled. So this would influence who then would be at the family internment camp in Crystal City, Texas. This was a document I found in the National Archives. In June of 1943, the Issei internees were transferred from army camps like Lordsburg and Camp Livingston in Louisiana to Santa Fe. The Santa Fe detention camp, or the Santa Fe, which became the Santa Fe Internment Camp. And they were transported to Santa Fe, of course, by train. And I verified the location and content of my grandfather's mystery photo. So there he is. This is now Santa Fe Internment Camp, Barrack 64. Over 4,500 Japanese men were imprisoned there at different times and for different durations. It was run by the Immigration and Naturalization Service and overseen by the Border Patrol under the Department of Justice from March 1942 until the camp was closed in 1946. In my book, I describe the internees' lives in these different prison camps based on Issei letters, journals, archival documents, photos, and so on. I'll start with mistreatment. As far as outright mistreatment was concerned, Professor Tetsuden Kashima, author of Judgment Without Trial, verifies that mainland residents, quote, received particularly harsh treatment, including severe physical abuse and solitary confinement at Fort Missoula in the early months of the war, unquote. The Hawaii Japanese prisoners experienced fear of death, strip searches, isolation, humiliation, shootings at Fort Sill and Lordsburg, stabbings, and psychological manipulation. In his memoir, Mr. Otani, the businessman I introduced you to earlier, describes what I call the Father's Day incident. The deception involved in the departure of the fourth transfer boat from Sand Island on 21st June, a few weeks after Mr. Kato and my grandfather left Honolulu in May. At 6 a.m., we were ordered to line up in a row and roll call was taken. Captain Eifler came in and said, "We have good news for you. Tomorrow is Father's Day, and so you will be able to meet your loved ones, your wives, your parents, and your children. So you should wear your best clothes and greet them with a smile." We were overjoyed that we would be able to meet our family. So from the previous day, we shaved and we prepared ourselves. The following day, the designated hour was 1 p.m. We were all deciding what we would wear, what we would say to our families, and we anxiously waited for the hour. It was 1 o'clock, then 2 o'clock, then 3 o'clock, but no family member appeared. We waited most anxiously. We lost hope, and it was already 4 o'clock. What came was the order for us to relocate to the US mainland. The order was that we would leave at 4:20, so we had to prepare for it. Receiving this opposite news, we were all disheartened, but because it was war, we could do nothing about it. At 4:30, we were put on a small boat from Sand Island. We were sent to the mainland, US mainland, on a military ship, but we were not allowed to go on the deck to say goodbye to the islands. Fortunately, Mr. Otani and his fellow prisoners were greeted at Lordsburg by the internees on Transfer Boat 3, which included my grandfather, Mr. Kato, Mr. Kawasaki, and others, who were among the first arrivals at that camp. But internee deaths at the hands of soldiers caused further anguish, anxiety, and fear. There was the shooting of Kanesaburo Oshima of Hawaii Island at Fort Sill. And at Lordsburg, there was an infamous and controversial shooting in July 1942 of two California Issei, Mr. Kobata and Mr. Isomura, who were ill and separated from the main group of arrivals, who were shot allegedly trying to escape. Mr. Kawasaki, as a civilian internee leader, expressed the condolences of the men in in Company 5 at the prisoners' services for Kobata and Isomura on 2nd August 1942. And I thought this was so interesting as a way of expressing condolence. Rather than speaking to the attendees in the audience, he presumably faced and addressed the deceased with the following poignant and telling words in Japanese. These were translated by Reverend Fujitani's son, who was also a Reverend Fujitani. Our two brothers who arrived at this camp from North Dakota, ailing in poor health, and who didn't even have the opportunity to become acquainted with the other internees here, sadly disappeared from the earth along with the desert dew. It is to be regretted to the utmost. The authorities tried to justify their action and claimed that they shot you because you tried to escape when told to stop. But that you, who were seriously ill, could have escaped is questionable. Common sense prevents us from believing so. Unfortunately, there was not a single eyewitness, and the incident was buried exactly as the authorities claimed. On Judgment Day, the person responsible will surely receive his due. Although we are utter strangers to you, both men were from Hawaii, were from California. These men were from Hawaii. We of Company 5 send you our most sincere condolences. We wish that you would accept them. But trauma took different forms. Members of the second transfer boat were sent to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and Otokichi Ozaki, a journalist, describes the physical conditions at Fort Sill, which took a psychological toll. Here at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where glittering heat waves rise and peak as far as the eye can see, the jumbled sound of machines and hammers can be heard, triggered apparently by the sudden need for more barracks. There's not a tree to be seen. Tents stand in rows. The heat, as though the wind is dead. No soap, no toothpaste for the past 2 months. What money we had was taken from us, so we have none. We become irritable. Eat, sleep, wake up. Eat, sleep, wake up. A life cut off from everything that in the world. The unbearable monotony of a life without variation seems to slowly warp our minds. The crazy weather and the tent life, one cannot help but begin to lose one's mind. Are we not becoming like leaky balloons, ambitionless, lethargic, and apathetic? I want to note, however, that the Issei prisoners from Hawaii and others did everything they could to survive and resist this mind-numbing monotony that Ozaki describes, and that another internee, Naojiro Hirano, referred to as barbed wire disease. He writes, "It has been said that an internee is most likely to succumb to the discouragement and depression known as barbed wire disease. To keep myself out of the disease, I'm participating in many activities at this camp." And I'd like to refer you to the exhibit that we have across the courtyard in the Palace of the Governors, because it does depict some of the artwork as well as the craft work that the internees did in order to deal with this barbed wire disease. So to understand these many activities that Mr. Hirano talks about, I borrowed a template of a psychologist named John Laffin, who describes how long-term captives often employ universal human strategies to cope with the deprivation of freedom and the malaise of boredom. Strategies that the internees adapted to their culture and practices as Hawaii Japanese. I'll just give you a few examples. Of the physically creative, there were, of course, paintings. They had exhibitions in the camp. And this was actually sometimes open to the guards, of course. Here you have an example of the sketches that Mr. Hoshida did. This is my grandfather on the left. And this man, Mr. Hoshida, was a self-made artist who did hundreds of portraits of different internees, such as this one. Mr. Matsumoto was 100 years old when I interviewed him. And he was a very active participant in these many activities. Here you have an example of his braiding. He actually took longleaf pine needles, braided them, and the braids were sewn into these purses. This larger one on the top is actually the size of a small briefcase. So it's quite an amazing craft that he learned in Hiroshima when he was a child and adapted to the environment at Camp Livingston. There was also the physically active, of course, which was very popular. They had different kinds of sports like sumo and baseball. Mr. Matsumoto was an active baseball player. I guess it was softball. But anyway, he was an active player, and he is here. This is Mr. Miho, whose family I also interviewed. Mr. Matsumoto also liked to perform in the theater. The Japanese internees had developed their elaborate costumes and elaborate performances, such as this one. These are his photos that he shared with me. And here he is playing the part of a woman. This was very common in Japanese theater to have men playing the parts of women. And this is one of the things he did. Here he is in plain clothes. But you can see the kinds of costumes that these men made. They made their own wigs and so on. So it was very elaborate. The intellectual strategy, of course, was extremely popular among the internees. We have examples of letters. This is from Lordsburg, a letter that my grandfather wrote to my mother. Reverend Matsuura, actually, I met him. He was in his late 90s at the time. And he had boxes full of letters that he had written home to his wife and baby daughter. However, they were also censored. And you can see here how they just the censors cut out either sentences, words, or complete paragraphs. Other forms of writing were the journal, such as Reverend Odate's journal. Mr. Kato, whom I introduced you to, the coffee farmer, kept an incredible journal, which was translated actually from Japanese into English by his wife and his daughter. So this was one of the most important sources of information for me. Mr. Kawasaki kept a scrapbook. He was one of the internee leaders. He was considered the spokesman at one time, so that was quite a high position. And he had a staff, but he kept this wonderful scrapbook, which also contained a lot of typed information. So for a researcher, this is very convenient, you know. And I relied also, in addition to Mr. Kato's journal, I relied a lot on his information for my book. Another example of this intellectual strategy were librettos, which were hand copied by internees. This was one from my grandfather, and this is downstairs in the World War II exhibit. Some of you may know what no theater is, and I won't explain it here, but it is a very classical form of theater, and one of the forms involves chanting. So these men had clubs before the war, but during the camps, they would also join in and chant in unison. So it was a very interesting, to me, a very interesting kind of symbolic form of community in a time of isolation. Petitions, though, were really very interesting very dynamic pieces of paper for me, because technically, as aliens, these men were not allowed to bring petitions forth. This was a right of citizens, of American citizens, but these men were outlawed from becoming American citizens. So the fact that they wrote petitions to the government, I think, was certainly an act of advocacy, self-advocacy. And this petition was signed by almost 200 men from Hawaii, Issei from Hawaii. And I'm presenting this to you partly because I think we have somebody in the virtual audience or even here who may see their grandfathers or great-grandfathers' names. So these pages include not only internees like my grandfather, but also the internees were fathers of men who lost their sons in Italy and France, killed in action. Another strategy which I added to Lafin's templates was a spiritual and ritual. These were services and ceremonies. Because I found so many photos of smaller and larger gatherings, I added this to Lafin's list as being very significant to the Japanese prisoners. So you see photos of Japanese men of different faiths. Here you have a large Christian funeral. It shows you the hundreds of men who were in the camp. These were certainly not all Christians, but they were supporters of the person who had passed away. And this photo, which will come up later in the afternoon with Dr. Chavez, this was a soldier's son named Ogden, who was brought in to attend the Buddhist service for his father, Nizo Nishizaki. Another and the last of the strategies that I wanted to mention was the imaginative strategy, which involved the writing of calligraphy. Some internees wrote plays, such as An Evening in Bethlehem. My grandfather had several copies of this handwritten, and I guess it was so that they could perform it. But poetry writing was a favorite pastime for some of the internees before the war, like Reverend Odate here in the corner. He was a Buddhist priest and he was a writer of haiku. His daughter told me that he thought in haiku. And his wife, would sit with a notebook wherever they went and would copy down the haiku as he recited them. Mr. Soga, a journalist, and others wrote tanka, and they continued the practice in the camps. And these men published their work and the work of others as well in collections such as this one, Kodama. Such publications were a testimony to their long-term purpose, one that transcended the boundaries of the Santa Fe Internment Camp's barbed wire. Soga clearly states the purpose of this collection to be both cultural and political, and for posterity. So I'll read you the preface that was translated for me. After the outset of World War II, from Alaska in the north to Hawaii in the south, Japanese men from all stations and walks of life were incarcerated in this camp in Santa Fe. Although we are from different backgrounds and situations, we are alike in that we have been forced to abandon our homes, leave our families, and experience the trauma and indignity of living in a prison camp. The Literary Society of Santa Fe Bunge Kyokai, was born in this harsh environment and circumstances. We have bonded in a unique way to express ourselves in poetry. The publication of this anthology, Kodama, is a demonstration to the world and future generations to come of the true Japanese spirit of Yamato Damashi, the strong Japanese character of calm in the face of unbearably harsh adversity. It is our hope that this effort will help to establish a peaceful world for future generations. These were educated and highly literate men who made every effort to maintain their cultural identities and forms, principally and deliberately through language, to maintain their integrity and dignity. Some of the internees who had sons in the US military returned to Hawaii in June 1945 before the war ended. but most of them who are still in Santa Fe, including Reverend Watanabe and some of the same men I introduced you to on Transfer Boat 3, left on October 30th for Seattle, Washington by train, and were shipped back to Honolulu, to Hawaii from Seattle on a military transfer boat in November 1945, 3 months after the war ended. I learned long after their deaths, that my grandmother had made the comment that my grandfather was a changed man when he returned. So although he resumed his job, his ministry, after he returned, it'll remain a mystery to me how he was personally before he was imprisoned and how he had changed. Not until 1988, long after Reverend Watanabe and many of his fellow internees were gone, did the US government exonerate the American Japanese and apologize for the injustice done to them during World War II. That only happened thanks to this tenacity and legal activism, really, of their children and grandchildren. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was signed by President Ronald Reagan on 10th August 1988, stating that wartime imprisonment was motivated largely by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. My original project, focusing on my grandfather, and then the larger community of Issei interned from Hawaii, expanded further in 2 major ways. I discovered this list in the National Archives, focused on Issei fathers who had soldier sons in the Pacific and Europe. This is a list of 161 Issei in the Santa Fe camp with 210 children, sons who were in the military. Some visited their fathers in Santa Fe and other camps. Some were killed in action in Europe and the Pacific. And I shared this story in November, this past November on Veterans Day, or for a Veterans Day Zoom talk. So these are some of the sons who were killed in action. Their fathers some of their fathers were in my grandfather's barrack. I also discovered serendipitously some Santa Feans who had memories of the internment camp in the present Casa Solana development. As I describe in the epilogue of my book, it all started with Lucia Ortiz Trujillo and her memories of candy being thrown by Japanese men arriving by train. Here's Lucy with her granddaughter, Lisa Pacheco. She told me a story, which I tell in the book. As I said, it was about candy being thrown by Japanese men arriving by train. Parts of these stories will be including that of the Rios family, will be brought to life in the following readers' theater performance. As much as the thousands of Issei and their American Japanese families wanted to forget those war years in order to survive and move on, this raises questions of remembering and forgetting, expressed also by Mr. Soga in this poem, written during his internment. When the war is over and after we are gone, who will visit this lonely grave in the wild where my friend lies buried? Who will remember him, them, their imprisoned presence, and how? Their legacies are also our inheritance, our responsibilities. With the marker dedication in 2002, my inspiration and feelings of deep responsibility to learn and tell this story of social injustice and social justice becomes full circle from April 2002 to today. I have been so encouraged and heartened by efforts of others to document the story. The CLO, or Confinement in the Land of Enchantment project was just getting started when we commemorated the 10th anniversary of the marker dedication. And this KNME video was made in 2011 and 12, when Jerry West and I were 10 years younger, and Patrick Nagatani was still with us. I'd like to share it with you as a tribute to Patrick.
May 12, 1944, Santa Fe Detention Station, Santa Fe, New Mexico. My dear Sumi, Gail holding the head of the wooden horse with her tiny hand and grasping some candy in her left hand and looking towards the side is a great picture. Here in Santa Fe, there is snow on the high mountains, but it feels as though summer is near. The naked trees have begun to dress themselves in green, but I miss Hawaii, which is always lush and green, and the flowers bloom ceaselessly. From your father, Tamasaku Watanabe.
Very little talk about the internment camp, even among adults, very few stories told. As a general pattern, people didn't talk much about those things. And even then, the Santa Feans basically wanted to forget that there was even such a thing.
We never heard anything about those days. Part of this had to do with not wanting to remember, perhaps. Some of it may have had to do with embarrassment or, shame.
I think it's in the Japanese culture as well, not to dwell on your own personal sadness and aspects. Certainly it is with the men. Rather than anger, they felt shame. And so within the culture, you don't talk about that.
During the war, we had almost no connection going out in that part of Santa Fe. I remember at one point, my older brother and I were up above the camp, up in the foothills there, kind of hunting rabbit and kind of looking down at the camp. They didn't encourage people coming around there.
My grandfather, Tamasaku Watanabe, was a minister of the Japanese Christian church. He basically worked for 30-something years until December 7th, 1941, which is when he was picked up.
It was 2 days after Pearl Harbor when my mom told me the story of how a couple of suits came up to the door and they took my grandfather away within 10 minutes. And the kids were left in the house, not knowing what was going on. Being taken from his family, it broke him. My grandfather lost his family business, loss. He lost his family, and he kind of lost his own history. He was a war veteran, and he would celebrate the most distinguished thing in his life being a war hero in the Japanese-Russian War. And finally, he lost his belief in the United States and what he felt it should be and what he could do, and went back to Japan after the war.
So I do feel that there were clearly different forms of injustice that these men had to experience. That makes me angry. It makes me realize that our Constitution is not infallible.
And then the reason they were chosen, of course, is because they were leaders of the communities. They were teachers, Buddhist priests, Presbyterian ministers, very fine farmers and businessmen. And the government felt that this was a preemptive thing. You know, they felt that an educated person who could speak 2 languages and had connections with the Japanese people, that they were dangerous.
Literacy was one of the ways in which they resisted what was called barbed wire disease. That malaise that could come over them, this depression and you know, that feeling of loss of control.
They were very gentle men. So my father, Hal West, you always saw the irony in it, you know, these guys with weapons and big guns that they would take up into the towers, and kind of the disconnect between that and the gentle quality of the men who were in the camp. Later on, I saw some of his sketches because he was an artist who did a lot of sketching in those years from the tower. And he drew a number of these guards in very relaxed positions, you know, like a guard on the phone or about to go to sleep and say, you know, all is well at post number 6. And he's sleeping there with a magazine over his face.
I think the predominant feeling for many of them was helplessness. What was interesting to me is that they tried so hard to cope with that, you know, to resist it, to not succumb to really what imprisonment can do to a person.
A lot of them denied what was going on, and the way you survive is to go inward and disregard what's out there.
And there were all kinds of examples of this that I found. Among them, artistic creations where they painted either in a Japanese style where they used their calligraphy or more Western style. They also had theater productions. They made their own wigs, they made their own costumes. One of their practices was to chant using the no librettos. All of the men who were in this club would pass these librettos around and would copy them in their own hand. And then they would sit there and chant. In all of these different forms, they were able to survive the experience, and they were able to continue their lives, which I think is the ultimate form of resistance and survival. Whether we learned or not, I guess remains to be seen. But I do feel that we have at least something in our history that we can look back on, and we can learn from it.
Injustices can happen again. They're happening today. And I think it's important to have compassion and understanding for people who are different, whether it be religious, color, brown skin, yellow skin, and understand that. Not only just in this country, but on a worldwide basis. Wouldn't that be wonderful?
So today, we can and must remember them and the injustices they suffered, as well as the peace and justice they wished for through pilgrimages, informal and formal, events, research, for only we can bring meaning to such memorials. Their legacy is in us and for us to maintain and act on. Thank you.
Time is always a frenemy. We're to 11:45, but I wonder, we have time to take a couple of questions, I think, before the players provides their second act. Are there a few questions that you would have?
I have a couple quick questions. Were there burials actually at the site of the internment, or were those burials returned to the families? And then my other question is, were there ever cases where the father and the son were interned together in a camp?
On the second question, yes. There was, I know of at least one case, Mr. Koike and his son were both interned, partly because they were both considered immigrants. In other words, the son was not born in the United States. Okay, and the first question about burial, we know there are two graves at the Rosario Cemetery.
Gail, thank you. Can you expand on what this did for them in terms of their heritage as Japanese Americans? I mean, how did it divide their own thoughts about what it meant to be an American, perhaps?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the first part of the question.
I'm curious how you think this experience changed their perception of what it meant to be an American.
Are you talking about the Issei?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think some of them were extremely disillusioned. You know, they were very disillusioned about what America meant and was to them. Some of them returned to Japan, as Patrick Nagatani's grandfather was disillusioned and returned to Japan. Others continued their lives and were very adamant about continuing to be productive members of society, and their children continued in that tradition. So I think there was certainly a natural difference among these different people depending on their treatment and their attitudes. Okay, someone online apparently is curious about the title of my book. It's Remembering Our Grandfather's Exile. Okay, here's another online question. Why were some people arrested from the territory of Hawaii interned in DOJ camps and others directly incarcerated in WRA centers? Was the determination strictly an alien enemy, non-alien enemy differentiation? Question is specific to Hawaii, not to WRA.
Why were so much sent to the DOJ?
Well, actually, the people, not only were people from Hawaii arrested and put in Department of Justice camps, there were people on the mainland at the same time. So on December 7th, men, primarily men, from both the mainland, Hawaii, Alaska, were rounded up and allowed hearings in some cases. But sometimes they were more pro forma than others. And they were rounded up and they were incarcerated.
So I'm wondering what families did to survive. Did the women left behind go to work? How did they support their families?
Well, that's a good question. In some cases, of course, if the family, in the case of Hawaii, if the family was pretty much intact, the father had been taken, or the father had been taken, the family was more or less intact. Like in the case of Mr. Kato, where they had a coffee farm, a son old enough to help. He was 16, he could help with the farming. In those cases, they tried to maintain themselves. But in cases, especially with the Buddhist priests, because they were the sole support of the family, and they had, left behind, they were in some cases a wife, or in some cases a wife with many children. They weren't able to survive very well. So in those cases, sometimes they chose to be reunited with the fathers, and they were sent in some cases to WRA camps, in some cases to Crystal City in Texas, which was the only, as far as I know, that was the only family camp for Department of Justice prisoners. Any other quick questions? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone.